See the title slide here
Yeah.
for the literature review cover page. So first of all, what is a literature review? Let's start with that. It's published information about a specific topic. It's sometimes bounded by a specific time period, or it's a review of published information about a specific topic. And normally, when you start to write a literature review, you may not have an exact frame for what it is you want to investigate. That's part of the intrigue of a literature review. It's almost a treasure hunt that you're finding out new things, not just verifying your own hypotheses or conclusions. In fact, you really shouldn't do that, but rather find out what there is to know about your topic from published information. And in education and most social sciences, we rely heavily on peer-reviewed journal articles, studies in particular, qualitative and quantitative, which I know you've talked about in other classes. One of the things about a literature review is that it summarizes the literature that you have decided is appropriate to include. However, it's not just a summary of the individual studies. You have to characterize those studies and weave them all together. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes here. It also synthesizes those studies, and that's the key attribute. One of the mistakes that people who have not written literature reviews make is that they'll summarize each study, 1, 2, 3, right in an order, right in a row, and that's it. And actually what you want is to come up with something new. Here are the published studies, and here is my take on this. Here's how I have reorganized it, reframed it, or resynthesized to come up with something new, to expose a gap or to problematize a particular situation. It situates. Your literature review will situate your study, if you're going to conduct a study, in the larger dialogue with all of these other studies and the authors of those studies. So that's an important part. Sometimes it's called a grand conversation, where all of the studies taken together on a particular topic are part of a dialogue. And you're going to synthesize that dialogue and find a space, a niche for yourself when you're writing a literature review. They're also good because it's important to stay in our field. It's so important to stay current and informed. Things are changing all the time, and we need to have a framework for thinking about what's new, what should be new, what's hot in the field, what's not in the field, and so on. And we want to be able to put all of that in a context that makes sense for our particular situations and our particular teaching assignments and the research that we may be doing. Sometimes literature reviews stand alone. And sometimes it will just be an assignment that a professor gives you with the aim of helping you to be current and informed and to engage in a synthesis in a creative manner. Other times, that literature review is going to be situated in a larger study. So if you decide that you're going to go on with the thesis, for example, in your master's program, then what you will be doing is writing an introduction. There will be a literature review. That literature review will situate the problem that you have explained in the introduction. And from there, then you go on to explain your teaching or your research methods. You'll go on to explain the study findings or the results, depending on the type of study that you are doing. And then write up a discussion and a conclusion, of course, on that. That's the normal format for a master's degree in our field. And it's fairly common in other fields as well. Though there are exceptions, there are times where it's necessary to add additional chapters and so on. But mostly you'll want to stick to that format. So the literature review gives you a framework or a foundation for not just replicating what somebody else does without realizing it, but for adding to the conversation. All right. So any comments or questions before we move on? I swiped this image from Lehigh University. I liked it because even though it's chemistry, it shows inputs into the flask, but outputs are something completely different. So this is the idea of synthesizing and situating the studies that we find. And we're going to take a look at how you do that in just a little bit. So moving on.
Can I have a question, please?
Absolutely.
When we are doing a comparative study, are we supposed to come up with something new? Because it's just a comparison of two things that are already there. So what would be our input here? Something new in which sense?
What's the purpose of comparison?
Well, because our assignment is about comparing two existing institutions or frameworks or projects, or so I don't know. For sure, we can find a specific objective in one item or two, but I'm not sure what could be the objective.
I think it might be worth defining what that objective would be. What is it that you need to take away from this comparison? If you're comparing two institutions or two organizations or two particular theoretical frameworks, I think you would want to find out why. I think that's a good question for the person who assigned this to you. They should be able to explain what it is that you're going to try to accomplish. Normally, the thing that we say about literature reviews is that you're going to expose a gap, that we're going to expose some place in the literature that has not been explored before or explored recently or in light of new findings and so on. So we're looking for that space where we can have our own voice, particularly if we're going on to conduct a study of our own, if we're going to engage in a thesis or a dissertation or just a research study. So I used the phrase mind the gap, which is popularized in the London Tube, the metro trains in London. Have these signs everywhere so that people don't fall into the gap between the train and the platform. And it's been, of course, used many other times in other ways as a popular culture. But here we have here we have the idea that there's a whole lot of literature about almost any topic that we want to investigate. So the trick is very often narrowing it down and finding that space. In education, maybe it's applying a concept in Egypt that has never been applied here before, but has been applied in the United States, in Central America, or so on. Or maybe it's applying a concept or determining if a concept could be applied in other situations, like a different grade level, different ages. Usually that gap is pretty small. Not always, but very often. It's a pretty small gap that you'll be looking for, because sometimes you'll open up the library. You go to the electronic resources in the library, and you're going to find sometimes thousands of hits. Other times your keywords won't take you anywhere useful, and you have to try new keywords and so on as you're looking for the literature. So that's why I think maybe it's worth finding out what is the purpose of the comparative studies assignment in this regard, because if you have a particular purpose, this needs to be your aim. And maybe it's to expose the difference between the two different phenomena, the two different institutions and so on. Maybe that's it, I don't know.
I think that this maybe is the objective, or at least this is how I saw it, to see what is the difference between the two, and if we are moving from one model to the other, what could be the challenges, what could be the opportunities. So I'm not sure if this is a nice way to formulate it.
It would seem to me, without knowing the assignment or the details of the class objectives and so on, I can't really tell you, but I can suggest that that's a generally good idea, that you would be then looking for the literature that describes the features of these institutions, the phenomena, and so on, and then making a comparison based on that, perhaps using a theoretical framework. Another approach is to problematize. This is used a little less often in traditional literature reviews, but very often when there's a body of literature, but it hasn't been brought together. For those of you who have followed my assessment work, you know that I referred to a study by Hattie and Timperley that were in the Review of Educational Research, published by the American Educational Research Association, and it's seminal. The reason is that there's been a lot of work on feedback and what the qualities of feedback are. So they synthesized all of the studies that they could find on feedback some years ago. I think it was 2008, I think. Maybe it was 2007. And what they did was reformulate it so that we could look at the different types of feedback that were that might be operationalized in a classroom setting or by a teacher and some students. So they came up with the notion of feed up, feed forward, and feedback. Feedback, in that case, being 2 words and not 1. That's a kind of a seminal study that was designed to problematize the idea of feedback. How do we make it useful to students? And that was their purpose for their search as well. And they exposed that gap, that there was never a really firm look at the qualities of feedback, and then they operationalized it in terms of how they synthesize the information. So problematizing is often a very good thing. When we problematize, we're very often looking at things that people have taken for granted. They've taken it for received knowledge. It's just the way it is. And so when we problematize, we question that. And we say, I wonder if feedback could be looked at in a different way, for example. So let's move on. If there are comments or questions so far.
That's fine.
Okay, moving on, so that we can get to the activity where you get to do a little synthesis here. So one of the things about a literature review is that it can be characterized as an argument, because you start out with a thesis statement, whether it's standing alone, whether the literature review stands alone, or it's part of a larger work like a thesis. You can think of it as an argument where you have a claim or claims, and you are looking for the evidence that supports it, or the data that supports it. And I'm going to show you how that's done in a few minutes. This is actually the work of Toulmin, Stephen Toulmin, who was it's Toulmin. And then I captured that in a book that I published a couple of years ago. And this is our result. So the claim is right there central on the right-hand side. The evidence that supports it is over to the left, but you'll see that there is a warrant in backing. The warrant is what makes the evidence suitable to support the claim. And the backing is the information that further supports the warrant. I'm going to show you an example. Sometimes we qualify that. Sometimes a claim is correct. It's not correct, but it's logical, and it's a good claim against the evidence, but there are ways to rebut that. There could be disconfirming evidence, for example. And in fact, if you're writing a really good lit review, you're going to start to notice that there is disconfirming evidence. Study A says A, study B says B, and they don't agree with each other. And that happens. It happens a lot. And that's why I recommend that in any writing you do in education or any of the social sciences, you should probably shy away from saying the study proves, because most studies don't prove anything. Taken together, they often strongly suggest or they indicate, but proving something in the social sciences, because humans are messy, is kind of tricky. The other thing is that sometimes a claim is true or is accurate. Let's use the word accurate. An accurate claim against the evidence under certain circumstances, and those are qualifications. So this is Toulmin's argument framework, and I'm going to show you how we're going to apply that in literature reviews. How many of you have seen the framework before? It's presented in some different ways, but generally it has at least the evidence, claim, and warrant sections. Okay, it's definitely one worth looking up and finding out a little bit more about. The book itself is really dense, but the argument that he makes, 4 arguments, is really useful. And in this case, of course, we don't mean the argument that's fighting over something, coming to blows or that sort of thing. Rather, an argument is a reasoned explanation based on evidence that supports a claim, and so on. So here is an example. Okay, I don't know if we have wrens in Egypt. Wren is a kind of little bird. And so our claim is going to be, the example is the family was justified in killing the wrens. because wrens are pests. And they make a mess, they're all over the place. And so in urban settings, suburban settings, that can be considered as pests. They're not the sort of thing that you want to capture and keep. They just fly around and make a mess. So the claim is, the family was justified in killing the wrens. The evidence is because wrens are pests. And the warrant is that it is ethically justifiable to kill the pests. So you can see that the warrant links the evidence and the claim. Now this is rather superficial, but I think you can see how we use a claim and evidence in a warrant to back up that claim. And one of the things that's a real problem in, particularly for novice writers in academia, academic writing is very different than writing in other genre and fiction, some sorts of creative nonfiction and so on. Academic writing has some features that are a little different and tricky to navigate. So one of the things that's easy to do, but that you shouldn't do, is make a claim without support. So how do you do that? Anyone want to take a guess?
Finding some literature that justifies the claim or back up the claim.
Mumtaz. Yeah, our evidence is going to be found in the literature itself, in the studies that we look up in the library, in EBSCOhost and ProQuest and so on.
Something that solidifies my point, something that goes along with what I'm suggesting, right?
Yeah, it needs to be around the topic. But do remember our point about disconfirming evidence, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute also, that sometimes a study says this and another study says, no, it's not this, it's that. And we're going to find these sorts of things. But generally, you're wanting to expose that gap, with the idea being that if you've done a sufficiently complete job, then you know the literature in the field and you can be conversant about that. You can sit down and talk with somebody else who knows that particular field, that particular topic or subdomain, for example. So here is another example. We have a claim, and this comes from an article that I'm writing right now. So I thought I would use it to see what you think. Okay, so does somebody want to read that, the claim?
Sure.
Alia, please.
Okay, so the claim says, the role of morphological awareness appears to contribute significantly to accurate word reading in Arabic.
And then the citation there. And we're not even going to try to pronounce Schneider's name. I hope I did it right. Okay, so that's our claim. But without support, it's really not a very good thing to put into a literature review. So we want to look for evidence and qualifications against that evidence. So a qualification is that written MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, has a vowel form that is relatively transparent and an undoweled form that is considered deep and more dependent on morphological rather than phonological knowledge during reading. That's a big mouthful, but morphological has more to do with the shape of an entire word and its meaning units. Phonological has to do with the sounds that constitute that word. So in this case, we have a qualification about MSA, about Modern Standard Arabic against other languages. The evidence is from Schiff, from the authors whose names you see there. In early readers, the vowel version of Arabic provides useful phonological information. And that's been documented by those authors. There's backing. A rough equivalent in English is to use the breve and the macron to help young readers note the difference between the short and the long vowel sounds. That was used, for example, a comparative as Edward Fry in 1964, who advocated using even more of these sorts of symbols in English. And as student readers gain experience, the diacritics that encode vowels become noise. There's a rebuttal from a researcher who's actually cited is helping to construct this, that though it may introduce crowding and make it difficult for young readers to discern the individual letters of the alphabet, the actual qualification stands. Okay, so this is how we use these sorts of language frames to situate the studies themselves, rather than just summarizing them one after another. We have another participant, that's Moment. All right, so what we have is, I'm going to send you actually a handout in the chat room. So hang on just a moment, please. Okay, you may want to open this, pop this open. Okay, so I created a handout for you, and it's in the Google Drive where you can access it. Please let me know if it doesn't open for you. Sometimes the settings in Google, I forget to click this or tap that button or whatever. So here's some language frames that can help us think about a really practical way to use argumentation in our academic writing. So can you see the language frames, or are you still looking at the PowerPoint?
I'm trying to open the language frame.
Okay. Let's just make sure this share. Okay, language frames are just
It
pieces
says we
of
need
sentences.
access to switch.
I'm sorry?
It says we need request access to open the Google Drive.
Oh, it opens for me.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll check it. Hi, Kulsum, how are you?
Hi, Rim. How are you? I'm fine, thank you.
Let's just change the setting to anyone with the link in case you're not logged into AUC. Okay, so a language frame is just bits and pieces of sentences that we use, but they're very commonly used in certain types of situations. And in this case, we're talking about argumentation. So take a look at the first one. The 3 reasons for selecting blank as an efficient source of energy are blank, blank, and blank. That's a language frame. Okay, so in this case, we could situate and in there. The 3 reasons for selecting solar energy as an efficient source of energy are, I'm going to make this up, I have no idea, cheap manufacturing, sustainable because the sun isn't going to go out anytime soon, and they do not rely on fossil fuels. Okay, so this is a language frame, and you don't want to just lift these and use them directly. You want to make them your own, but you can see how the language frame helps you situate your argument in a way that is encouraging you to make a claim. In this particular instance, there's a claim here: the 3 reasons for selecting solar energy or for wind farms as an efficient energy source. That's a claim. And then we have, while some people might say, now I want you to notice this, while some people might say there are disadvantages to using, such as, let me start over. While some people might say that there are disadvantages to using solar energy, such as, we can name a fake author here, Mr. Anti-Sun, I believe that solar energy is still the best because, and here's my reasons. All right, so these are language frames, but we want to make sure that we've situated them in the example using the literature. So where it says some people, while author A, cite 2020, might say that there are disadvantages and so on, we use that language to put it to the language frame to start to situate our understanding. A note of caution here is that these use first person in this case, but some professors encourage you not to use first person in your academic writing. There are reasons to do so and to not do so. But even so, you can, even in this case, you can still think of the frames as a way to start thinking about argumentation. So in this case, the 3 reasons for selecting solar energy as an efficient source of energy are blank, blank, and blank. Okay, so in this case, we haven't used the first person pronoun I, but we've still kept the basics of the language frame. You see the difference here? And so, and here's our example where we're going to use those language frames as a way to situate the studies that we have found and to put them in an academic context. So what do you think? Is there something you can do?
Not really.
Yes, you can. Closer, I know you can.
I,
But that's why I made it a handout for you, actually. You might want to download, because if you start to write a literature review, look at examples of good literature reviews, look at the handout, and look at the way that the language is shaped. Look at the way that the claims are made. And all of this in this section, I took out of one paragraph in the paper. This whole section here came out of one paragraph. And I just pulled out the claims, the backing, the warrant, the evidence, and so on, the rebuttal, and so on, just to highlight how it was done. It actually did not show up in exactly that order, but in terms of illustrating how claims are supported in an argument, I thought it might be useful to reorder them just a little bit. So this is basically how it's done. All of the studies you use in a literature review, it's all about the study, the studies that you find, by the way. So you want to stick to that. Sticking personal experiences and so on probably is not a good place for that, is not the literature review. There are places in studies where you can do that, but the literature review generally is that review of what others have said and how you position that, rather than your own ideas or experiences. Let's see. Okay, so if you start to look at the literature reviews that well, most any study, when one of your professors gives you an article to read, very often they're studies, not always. There are scholarly works that are not studies, commentaries and so on. Commentaries are generally a little less reliable in terms of supporting your work. You know, I'm going to take that back. That's not true. But generally, a commentary is based on a wide range of experience, and it can be helpful in establishing a theoretical framework, in taking a look for new directions in research, or even creating your own conceptual framework. One of the things that you'll see is theoretical framework and conceptual framework. So let's come back to that in a minute. Sarah, you have a little
Thank you.
bit.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a question, if you don't mind. I'm sure you said it, but I think I missed it. When in what context should we use the language frame that you sent us? Is this a template that's recommended to be used in all the literature reviews, or is this something that we should just take ideas from as to how to structure our own literature review?
Yeah, the examples in the language frame document were kind of a step in the right direction. They were used for creating persuasive arguments, but they weren't necessarily intended for situating your argument in a literature review. So think about it as a step, but you want to probably avoid making a lot of assertions about, I think that solar energy should be level, or the three reasons are. But it is a good way to start thinking about how to situate the authors whose works you'll be citing. They say, they meaning the authors that you see in the parentheses here, they say this. Others say that. Others support this idea, but others think maybe it's not exactly accurate. So on. Does that help a little?
Yes, thank you very much.
Of course. Okay, so let's move on here. Just think of it as links in a chain, the whole thing. Argument strung to argument. Of course, you'll have many, like the paragraph that I showed you, and I picked out the parts. You'll have many such arguments like this within your literature review, but also overall, the entire literature review is you can generally think of this as a kind of a chain, with every section, every paragraph links with every other paragraph, with the ones before and after it, with every section linking to the one before it, so that it builds up to a solid conclusion that says, this is the gap that this literature review has exposed. This is the problem that this is how we've problematized this knowledge, so that we can look at it in a new way, or we can rethink it, or recreate our understanding, and so on. So I just like the metaphor of the chain just because it's really a good way to think about organizing your paper, which is our next topic. Okay, so organizing. Keep in mind summarizing and synthesizing. Anyone want to take a shot at what the difference is between summarize and synthesize? If not, it's okay. They're easily confused.
Summarize is to keep the ideas as they are, just to make it together in a brief summary. But synthesize means that we are going to see when those ideas are put together, what can come up as new, or how they can affect each other, or something like that.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly what I would have said, except that you did it better. So yeah, summarizing is just capturing the essence of whatever the item is, in this case, another study. We want to summarize the study. And sometimes we do want to summarize the study, indicate what the methods were, and so on. One of the reasons to look at the methods of a given study is to make comparisons. In a qualitative study, it's up to the reader to make generalizations based on their own context. In a quantitative study, it's intended to be generalizable to a population of some sort. And we want to know that, because if we start comparing qualitative and quantitative studies, or certain types of studies that gathered information from one sample of a population to another sample that's not alike, these are all worth knowing before we determine how and where or if we're going to include that in our literature review. So summarizing is usually going to be focused on any one given study and how we characterize what was said in that study that's relevant to our literature review. The synthesis is, like you said, it's almost like a bouquet of flowers. It's putting together different parts to reorganize, to resynthesize, to resynthesize is not a good definition for the word synthesize, but to reorganize and create something new, like the example in the chemistry flask in one of the earlier slides. Okay, so keep in mind those two things. Summarizing is appropriate, but it's not the only thing you should do. Synthesizing is your main goal. Summarize to explain the particular study, synthesize to show how the studies fit together. So just like most other research, we can say that we have an introduction, or most other writing rather, we say we have an introduction, we have a body, we have a conclusion, we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in literature review, we want to be a little more focused on what we're going to do. In the introduction, we want to explain what it is we're exploring. What's the topic? Why is it a relevant topic? What problem might you be looking to solve, for example? Okay, so that's what you'll do in an introduction. That's not usually too long, depends on what the requirements of the literature review are, whether it's for a journal article. These are always going to have, if you're writing for a journal, they're almost always going to have a page length or a page limit, just because they have to manage workload. They have a certain number of pages they can put in print. It's a little less important these days with publication online, but still, you're going to have a page limit or a word count or something like this. So you have to take all of that into account. It becomes really easy to spend all of your time writing a literature review and not enough time exploring the study itself. If you do a thesis, you write an article describing a study of your own and so on. In the body, this is where we start to work on our synthesis. This is where we're going to look at the claims made, the claims that we can assert based on the studies, and how we can support those with evidence or data, how we can support those with warrants, backing, and what qualifications there are, or what rebuttals are there, disconfirming evidence, and so on. Bodies can be organized several different ways. They can be organized chronologically. Sometimes when we're looking at the history of an idea, we might want to organize chronologically. In one part of that article that I mentioned to you about modern standard Arabic, I characterized studies about how we analyze text for readability. And I did it in a historical or chronological method, starting with the earliest iterations of how we determine readability of the text, and make our way toward the current era. Other times we want to look at the methods that were used, and I skipped thematically on purpose, the methods that are used. So you might look at certain types of case studies, or case studies that look at only a particular age group or a particular sample or population, only students with that are on the autism spectrum, for example. We want to look at those based on the type of method. Was it quantitative? Was it qualitative? Was it, if it was qualitative, was it a case study? Was it a phenomenology, a phenomenological study? Was it a narrative study, and so on? And we want to look at this too. If it were quantitative and quantitative, maybe we're looking at correlations, which are useful, but they don't compare in the same way that regression analyses do. So you have to pay attention to what the methods are, and organizing your body text by method can be really important. Thematically is probably what most people do, and what you will probably do if you were assigned to write a literature review here at AUC, or if you are going to be writing a thesis, working on a study with another colleague, and so on. Thematically organizes around subtopics and subtopics. One way to think about this is that if you had each study written out on a 3x5 card, I don't know what you would call that in metric, but it's a card about the size, a little bit larger than a credit card, maybe twice the size of a credit card. And you've written the study name and the essence of it, and then you put that into a stack. You'll have a stack of these cards for each of the studies you've looked at. This is for imagery. I don't do this anymore. I've done it in the past. I don't do it anymore because I use electronic tools. But if you think of a set of cards, now you can put them into piles. These 3 studies address this theme within my topic. These 3 studies address my topic in a different way. And these 5 studies, and you see where I'm going with this. If you could visualize putting your studies into separate piles, then you can see how we might organize things thematically. Then of course, draw your conclusions, make your recommendations. Recommendations are very often, excuse me, where you found that gap, what you problematized, what might be studied next, what research still needs to be done. And in fact, a good way to start thinking about a topic of your own is to look at other people's studies and look at the implications, the suggestions for further research, and even find published case studies that are, not case studies, published literature reviews, such as those you find in the Review of Academic Research. Review of Educational Research, Review of Educational Research. And look for the ways that they characterize the studies and what the conclusions are and what they suggest still needs to be done, because almost always that's going to be an outcome. Kulsum, you have a blue hand.
Yes, Professor. I have a question. For example, if we are writing a research paper, so should we do literature review first, like thematically, if I say, and then we use this theme again into the when we are analyzing our data? Like, can we do it together, or we have to do it separately? For example, we first present our theme or concept, and then when we analyze our data, we refer to them, or we can do it together. Should I explain again?
Yeah, please.
Okay, for example, when we write a research paper, or maybe like when we conduct a study, like we collect data and everything, it's not second-hand, like first-hand data. So if we, so for example, when we analyze our data, or discuss the findings, especially, So like what should we do? We refer the conceptual analysis, or we can do it together. Like we do, for example, if we say like formative assessment as a like concept, and then I present my data and analysis on the basis of formative assessment, or we do it separately.
Okay, I think I've got it. So yeah,
Thank you.
actually, it's a very good question. If you are writing a literature review that is going to be part of a study, your thesis, some other type of study, then that's all secondary and tertiary sources. You're not going to be doing any work with actual human beings in the case of social sciences research, for example, or educational research. It's all from the library. Sometimes you hear the word desk review used as a sort of a synonym for literature review. It's all the things that you can gather, the data you can gather, the studies you can gather from somewhere else. Then you will do your study. You write your method section, you get it approved, you go conduct the study with actual human beings, and then you write up your findings or results. Then you come back to discussion. In discussion section, typically that's a last or second to last chapter, depends on how you organize.
Yeah.
In that discussion section, you weave it all together. What does the literature say compared to what you found with your particular study? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So yeah. So my question is it okay to repeat like it's twice? That like in literature review, I explained already, and I'm referring them when I was discussing. So is it okay, like, or is like repetition is not okay, or what?
Yeah, what you can do here is you probably don't want to just repeat right out, but you can say, in the study by author A, we explored in the literature review in a previous section, she found blah, 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 and that fits with my findings, with the findings of the present study. You can do those sorts of things. You don't want to just repeat it right out, but you've got to link it back to.
Yeah. So, but I have to give the insight like in text citation that okay, this say this. Maybe not the exactly what I said, but maybe like the summarize the things, what I said in the literature review, and then I refer to that and put my findings, right?
Yeah, how your findings fit. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay. It match or it doesn't match, like whatever I argue there. Like my findings is like, okay, is the same or it's not the same with the literature. Like I cannot.
Yeah. You can definitely contrast. You can say, the studies explored earlier in this paper suggest X, Y, Z, but my research shows actually W, V, and U.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good outcome of a study where you can say others found this. I am finding something a little different, and that's why it's important to write up a good method section so that you can show how you've come to this conclusion.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Very welcome. And of course, in your conclusion, you want to mind that gap or go with an explanation of how you problematized something given, something taken for granted, and so on. So these are the organizational features. And so we've looked at the construction of an argument on a paragraph level, more or less, sometimes across multiple paragraphs, depends on how much detail you need to go into, and then situated that within the organization of an overall literature review. So here's some of the things that I look for in a literature review. These are just features. They're in no particular order except for number 8. All right. So first of all, we want a thorough understanding of whatever the topic or phenomena is that we're looking at. It's often very narrowly focused, but still, whatever that focus is, you need to have explored it such that somebody else can't come along and say, well, you forgot about this famous seminal study. You don't want anyone to do that. You want to be the one who's discovered this and referred to it if it actually is a seminal study. A seminal study is one that you see repeated often in literature on your given topic. So I often write about ICTs in technology, and because of my particular field in literacy, I very often cite Don Liu, who just retired from the University of Connecticut, because he and his team, they had a huge grant, and they wrote and wrote and wrote. And so they have a vast portfolio of work that can be drawn upon. And I use their work quite often, for example, okay? When I write about writing, exactly, writing, the actual physical act of generating text, I very often refer to the work of Appleby and my mind just drew a blank, Langer and so on. These are seminal works, even though they're quite old. So you're going to see that sometimes your professor will say, you need to use literature that's within the last 5 years. And okay, that's fair enough, because if we don't look at the more recent stuff, then we don't understand the argument. If we only look at the older things, but sometimes we want to include that seminal study. So this goes with the idea of a thorough understanding. How well do you know the topic? Are you conversant? And it's okay to say, no, I didn't know that thing, that idea, but for the most part, if you've got a topic, you need to have a thorough understanding of it when you're writing a literature review and be able to demonstrate that. You need to delimit the topic. In delimiting the topic, what you're doing is defining exactly what it is you're going to do and what you're not intending to do. Let me think of an example. In the Modern Standard Arabic that we looked at, the rough draft that we looked at a few moments ago, the paragraph, we've delimited the topic to looking at specific features of Arabic and how children read. We've looked at word length, we have looked at the Arabic script, and we have looked at frequency and dispersion. Okay, I don't need to explain what all of that means exactly, but those are the 4 areas that are our topic. And we've delimited that and said there are other things about learning to read. We're not looking at those, only these 4 things. Okay, so number 3 is sometimes it's very helpful to indicate what your search methods are. So you might see in examples of literature reviews that an authorial team, a team of authors, have worked on, and you very often see teams of authors on this, or pairs of authors at least, but in any case, whoever it is, however large or small the group is, you might see that they have stated, we used the EBSCO database looking over the past 15 years for studies that were qualitative case studies. We looked in the ProQuest database for quantitative studies that included regression analysis over the past 10 years using these keywords. And those are the sorts of things that we see in search methods. We have to describe how we've done this because it also helps us to delimit the topic. Otherwise, some topics are just too wide. A rather famous example is the National Reading Panel from the United States around the turn of the millennium. They looked at reading and how children learn to read, and they produced a policy document. It was a giant research paper. And what actually came out of that, though, was what we can take away in terms of a literature review is that they put their research in terms of qualitative studies only. They had some other parameters that went with particular types of qualitative studies, and they excluded others because otherwise the field was way too big for them. And they wanted studies that they felt could be replicated and then put into action in classrooms. So defining your search methods is sometimes very important. And it's something you can take away from that too, is that if you can describe how you chose your particular studies, what search terms you used, then you help others understand how you derived your conclusions. Of course, we talked about synthesis and we talked about identifying those methods, which is sometimes very important. And we've talked about that, so I won't go back into that too much. Look for transitions too. The topic, subtopic A, should lead to subtopic B. Subtopic B should lead to C, so that you have a chain of arguments that all lead up to a conclusion that flows logically from the studies that you have reviewed. Take care when you are working on a conclusion that you are not drawing conclusions that are not in the actual evidence. It seems to make sense, but it's actually very easy to do, to say, I believe that the studies described earlier in this literature review prove, remember what we said about prove, or demonstrate that some claim that's not actually there. In a literature review, you're only characterizing those studies and how you can synthesize them into coherent argument, okay? I see that I have left a stray apostrophe. We do want to look for disconfirming studies on purpose. It's really easy to, sometimes you hear the term cherry pick, which is an idiom, but it means looking for the cherries that support my argument and ignoring all the ones that don't. If you ignore the arguments, the studies, other literature reviews that don't support your hypothesis, then you're actually opening yourself up to being shot down, figuratively, of course, being shot down in an oral defense, by a reviewer in a journal and so on, because they're going to say, well, did you not know about this study that shows something different? So it kind of goes to what Kulsum had said also about how we situate that, and what if our study shows something different? We need to be aware of that and take into account those. I put style, particularly APA, last because it's important. I think that you may have been in one of these workshops with Dr. Praputi a week or two ago. And so he covered all of this. I'm not going to, but I will say two things about APA. One, it's developmental. You're not going to get it right every time, all the time. So take the time to help each other out when you've got an assignment. And APA is, the professor is going to be very strict on that. Help each other out. Share your work. Say, can you help me with this one? I'm not sure about capitalization here. I'm not sure about italics. Use your drafts to help each other as you're working with APA. And over time, you will get better at it. And about the time you really have it down, APA will come along and issue a new guide anyway, just like they did last year. So actually the new one, the APA 7, is not that different from APA 6, except in a few very key specific areas. So it's important for the second reason that it's important is it actually communicates information. If I look at a reference list and I see italics, I know right away that what I am looking at is the title of a journal or the title of a book. I don't even have to know that particular book. Italics tells me that in the reference list,